What is up, everyone? My name is Kel, Red Zone MTG, and today I have another Oathbreaker deck video for you guys. Today we are covering the dreaded Narset, Parter of Veils, with her signature spell, Days Undoing. A lot of folks have already surmised that this is a very powerful combo, and I assure you guys, it is. A lot of people go with Windfall instead of Days Undoing here, but I think Days Undoing is where you want to be. Before we start talking about the cards, I do want to note that this deck is a little bit more budget friendly than some of the other ones that I've covered so far. It is a very powerful deck, but it's also a little bit unfun to play for some people. Really talk to your play group if they're okay with something like this before you bust out a deck like this, because, you know, like I just said, it can be a little unfun to play against. But yeah, let's start talking about some of the cards. We're going to start off with our Oathbreaker here, Narset, Parter of Veils. Narset, Parter of Veils is a 3-drop planeswalker for 1 of any. Double blue, she has 5 starting loyalty. She has this static ability that says each opponent can only draw 1 card per turn. She also has a -2 of you get to look at the top 4 cards of your deck. You may reveal a non-land, non-creature card from among them, put it into your hand, and then the rest go on the bottom of your library in a random order. So yeah, she is very powerful. She lets you dig for combo pieces or control pieces. We're not playing a lot of combo here, and by not a lot, I mean we're not playing any combo here. This is a control style deck, but it lets you get whatever you need. Draw spell, counter spell, wheel spell, all that kind of stuff. Speaking of wheels, she is very, very powerful with wheel effects. Because they can only draw 1 card per turn, they end up discarding their hand and drawing 1 card, and we get to draw, like, you know, 7. Speaking of which, let's talk about Days Undoing. This is a sorcery for 2 of any and a blue. This is very, very close to a power 9 card Time Twister. What it says is each player shuffles his or her hand and graveyard into his or her library, so we're not playing a mill strategy, then draws 7 cards. If it's your turn, end the turn. And that's alright, we don't mind ending the turn. Days Undoing will be the last thing we do in our turn, and then we can, you know, hold up counter magic or other instant speed effects. And being able to draw 7 cards is very, very good. And if we have good old Narset on the battlefield, our opponents only draw 1 card. And yeah, you can kind of see how that can be a little bit unfun to play against, especially considering all the counter spells and other control stuff we're running in the deck. And speaking of that, let's start talking about the rest of the deck. And let's kick it off with some cantrips and or draw spells. We run Brainstorm, Ponder, Serum Visions, and Preordain. Once again, this is like the quintet, quartfecta. These are the 1-drop draw spells that you want to run. Basically, some of the best 1-drop draw spells in the entire game. They're just fantastic cards and, you know, staples of any blue deck that can feasibly run them. I also run a Jace Beleren, colloquially known as Party Jace, because he lets everyone draw a card. He's just a 3-drop, 1 of any, double blue, 3 loyalty, +2, each player draws a card, -1, target player draws a card, and then a -10 of, you get to mill someone for 20. We're not really going to be doing that. The +2 is actually very, very good here, because if we wheel in the same turn, their opponent only gets to draw 1 card per turn, so you get to draw an extra card, +2 Jace, and your opponent does not get to draw it because they already drew their 1 card per turn when you did your Days Undoing or whatever. So yeah, I really like Jace Beleren in this deck. I mean, I think he's pretty good in general. And then I also run Hieroglyphic Illumination. Folks who play Pauper already know that this card is fantastic. It is an instant for 3 of any and a blue. It just says draw 2 cards, which is kind of like a bad instant speed divination. However, it also has cycling of just a blue, and then you get to draw a card. So early game, you can just pay a blue, just draw a card, which is fantastic. And in the late game, you can draw 2 cards. I think this card is very, very good. Basically, think of it as 2 modes. 1 mana, draw a card, or 4 mana, draw 2 cards if you need it. Really, really good card. Speaking of drawing cards, let's talk about our wheel effects. And we do run a good number of wheel effects outside of our signature spell. We have Windfall here, 2 of any and a blue. Each player discards his or her hand and then draws cards equal to the greatest number of cards a player discarded this way. Pretty good. Not as good as Days Undoing, because Days Undoing always lets us draw 7 cards no matter what, which is fantastic for us. And our opponents, you know, are only ever going to draw 1 card anyway. So yeah, Windfall is a really, really good card. We have Jace's Archivist, who basically lets us wheel every single turn. He's a 2/2 Vidalcan Wizard for 1 of any, double blue. For blue and tap, each player discards his or her hand and then draws cards equal to the greatest number of cards a player discarded this way. He lets you Windfall every single turn. Pretty solid, you know. Windfall's good. Jace's Archivist lets us do that every single turn. Next up, we have Teferi's Puzzle Box. This is one of my favorite cards in the whole deck, other than having fantastic Kaja art. This card says, at the beginning of each player's draw step, that player puts the cards in his or her hand on the bottom of his or her library in any order, then draws that many cards. It's an artifact for 4, and if we have Narset on the battlefield, our opponents can only draw 1 card per turn. So basically, they have to put their whole hand on the bottom and then just draw a single card. This is a repeatable wheel effect, and yeah, it's pretty good. Next up we have Wheel and Deal. Gavlan Wheel, Gavlan Deal. I suppose only Dark Souls players would get that reference. But anyway, Wheel and Deal, instant for 3 of any and a blue. Any number of target opponents discards his or her hand and then draws 7 cards, and then I get to draw a card. Not as good as some of the other ones, but it is instant speed. And basically, if we have Narset out, you know, all your opponents discard their hand and then draw a card, and then we get to draw a card. That's pretty good. And then finally we have this Time Reversal, which acts pretty closely to Day's Undoing. And it also has really, really cool art, to be honest. It says each player shuffles his or her hand and graveyard into his or her library, then draws 7 cards, then you exile Time Reversal. So you don't get to recur it, which is kind of a bummer, but you know, it's an extra wheel effect, it's an extra draw 7, just, you know, auto-include in my opinion. Next up, we have a big old chunk of counter spells here. We're going to start off with Baral, Chief of Compliance. He himself doesn't get 2 counterspell stuff, but he interacts with that, so I'm going to talk about him here. He is a 2-drop, 1/3 for 1 of any and a blue human wizard. Instant and sorcery spells you cast cost 1 less to cast, which is, you know, fantastic. And whenever a spell or ability you control counters a spell, you get a loot. You get to draw a card and then discard a card. Just, you know, absolutely fantastic card. I think everyone kind of already knows the power of Baral here. Next up we run Stifle. I've talked about Stifle before. This card is a huge miserly card. It's really sweet. An instant for 1 blue, counter target activated or triggered ability. And you want to know what an activated or triggered ability is? You know, like a Planeswalker ability, like their ultimate or a fetch land or something like that. Stifle is a pretty hilarious card. Next up we have Spell Pierce. Counters a non-creature spell unless its controller pays 2. Really, really good in this format because, you know, Planeswalkers are non-creature spells. We run Force Spike. Just, you know, pretty good in this format too because decks tend to be pretty lean in their curves. People tend to tap out often, so Force Spiking is, you know, pretty solid. If your play group doesn't do that, then you might want to swap this out with a different card. Next up we have Arcane Denial, and I absolutely love this card for Narset. It's an instant for 1 of any and a blue. Counter target spell. Its controller may draw up to 2 cards at the beginning of the next turn's upkeep, and if we have Narset out, well, guess what? They only get to draw 1 card per turn. And then I get to draw a card at the beginning of the next turn's upkeep, so yeah, really good. They kind of get hosed a little bit on their advantage of this card, and it makes it a lot better in my opinion. Next up we have straight up Counterspell here with one of my favorite arts of my childhood. He always looked like the character Airtie from the Weatherlight Saga, but I don't think it is. Anyway, really cool, just, you know, Counterspell. Next up we have this really cloudy foil Mana Leak. Yeah, Mana Leak, pretty efficient. Counter target spell unless the controller pays 3. Usually you'll get them with this card. Next up we have Dream Fracture, a card that I really, really like for Narset in the same way that I liked Arcane Denial, because it's a counter spell that lets our opponent draw a card, and then we get to draw a card. However, it doesn't say at the beginning of like the next turn, it just says counter target spell, its controller draws a card. Well, if it's your opponent's turn and they've already drawn a card and we already have Narset out, they don't get to draw a card. This is just counter target spell, I get to draw a card for 3 mana. It's like a 3 mana cryptic command almost, without the other abilities, but still, really, really solid in Narset. I would run this in every single Narset build. Next up, we have Supreme Will. I talk about this card a lot. One of my favorite counter spell / draw spells, because that's what it does. It lets you counter a spell unless its control pays 3, or you get to look at the top 4 cards of your library and put one of them in your hand and the rest on the bottom in any order. So it's a counter spell if you need it. It's a draw spell if you need it. Just very versatile. I like it a lot. Next up we have Unwind, and I'm running 2 of these type of counter spells. This is an instant for 2 of any and a blue, counter target non-creature spell, and then untap up to 3 lands, so it's kind of like a free counter spell if you have at least 3 mana to play it. Very similarly, we run Rewind. This is literally the same effect, except it just says counter any spell instead of a non-creature spell. Once again, fantastic card, just, you know, lets you do multiple things in the same turn. Counter spell, untap, and then play like a draw spell, or one of the instant speed wheel effects like Wheel and Deal, or something like that. Yeah, really solid. And then finally, Mystic Confluence. I run this in almost all my blue decks as well. It's a really good like budget card, especially if you don't have the money for a cryptic command. 3 of any, double blue. Choose 3. You may choose the same mode more than once. Counter target spell unless the control plays 3. Return target creature to its owner's hand or draw a card. So you can counter a spell, bounce a dude, draw a card, draw 3 cards, really counter a spell, bounce 3 things. This card's fantastic. You should definitely run this in your blue decks. Next up, I run Kasmina, Enigmatic Mentor. She's a really cool planeswalker from War of the Spark. She costs 3 of any and a blue. She has 5 starting loyalty. She says, spells your opponents cast that target a creature or planeswalker you control cost 2 more to cast. So she basically makes it more difficult for your opponent to remove her or Narset or any of your other dudes. And she has a -2 of you create a 2/2 blue wizard token if he can get in focus here. And then you get to draw a card and then discard a card. Pretty solid, you know. Creates blockers, creates attackers, and then protects your guys. I mean, I really like Kasmina, honestly. I think she's a fantastic planeswalker. Next up, we have one of my favorite cards of all time, Vendilion Clique. You don't really need to put this in the deck, but if you have it, you should probably run it. I think it's really good in Narset. What it is, it's a 3/1 legendary creature, fairy wizard for 2 blue and 1 of any, flash, flying. When it enters the battlefield, look at target player's hand. You may choose a non-land card from it. If you do, that player reveals the card, then puts it at the bottom of his or her library, then draws a card. Well, you know what? Usually this is just like, oh, they replace a card in their hand. But if you have Narset on the battlefield, they just put the card on the bottom of their library, and then they don't draw a card if it's their turn, because they've already drew a card for their turn. Vendilion Clique is usually a pretty solid card, but in Narset, I think it's even better, which is pretty crazy. Next up, I run Back to Basics. This card used to be very expensive, and now is only like 10 bucks or something, which is not too bad considering it used to be like a, I don't know, like $50, $60 card. It's an enchantment for 2 of any and a blue. Non-basic lands don't untap during their controller's untap steps. I kind of like to think of this as the blue Blood Moon. We are playing a mono blue deck. We're running a ton of islands, so Back to Basics just basically doesn't affect us, and it can kind of hose over most of our opponents. And speaking of islands, I want to go over some of our removal spells and or effects, starting with the Dalkon Shackles. It's an artifact for 3 of any. You may choose not to untap it during your untap step, and you can tap 2 and tap it and gain control of target creature with power less than or equal to the number of islands you control for as long as it remains tapped. And we're running a lot of islands, so basically this lets us steal any of our opponent's creatures unless they have like a 20/20 Merit Lage or something like that. It's a fantastic card. On the spendier side of things, but if you have one, you should definitely run it in basically any mono blue deck that you have. Next up, we have Thing in the Ice. This card is a staple of Spellslinger decks, especially if you're running blue. It's a 0/4 creature horror for 1 of any and a blue defender. It enters the battlefield with 4 ice counters on it. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, remove an ice counter. Then, if it has no ice counters, you transform it. And it breaks through the ice and turns into the Awoken Horror, which is a 7/8 Kraken Horror. And when it transforms, you get to return all non-horror creatures to their owner's hand. So you basically get to bounce everything and you get a 7/8. This is a really good board wipe and finisher for our deck. Next up, we have a really good blue removal spell with Reality Shift. It's an instant for 1 of any and a blue. Exile target creature, then its controller manifests the top card of his or her library. So basically that means they put the top card of their library onto the battlefield face down, and it's a 2/2 manifest creature token. If it's a creature, it can be turned face up for its mana cost. What this typically boils down to is you get to exile their creature, and then they have like a Llanowar Elves underneath, or like a land or a spell or something like that. It's very rare that you manifest something that's actually pretty good. It can happen, but Reality Shift in general is a fantastic card. And then finally, I run Aetherize, and I'm running this instead of Cyclonic Rift for the deck. If you have Cyclonic Rift, you should probably just run Cyclonic Rift. I think Aetherize is an okay alternative. It's not really quite the same thing, but it still is pretty good. It's an instant for 3 of any and a blue. It says return all attacking creatures to their opponent's hand. So this card basically just punishes really aggressive decks or token decks. You can use this when your opponents are attacking each other to bounce stuff. Doesn't have to be attacking you. I think it's a pretty solid card. Next up, I have Spellseeker. She is a 1/1 human wizard for 2 of any and a blue. When it enters the battlefield, you get to search your library for an instant or sorcery with converted mana cost 2 or less, and then just put it in your hand. That's really good. Go get a counter spell, go get a draw spell. If you're running Cyclonic Rift, go get a Cyclonic Rift. I think this card is just a fantastic card. Tutors are, you know, pretty good. Next, I have Archaeomancer. This is a 1/2 for 2 of any and 2 blue, which is not a good rate. Human wizard, but when it enters the battlefield, you get to pick a instant or sorcery card in your graveyard and put it back into your hand. So get back your best wheel, get back your counterspell or Mystic Confluence or whatever. I like this card quite a bit. And then finally, we have Torrential Gearhulk. This card is fantastic because it doubles as a threat and as a way to recur instant. It is a 6-drop, 4 of any, double blue, 5/6 with flash. It is an artifact creature construct. When it enters the battlefield, you can cast target instant card from your graveyard without paying its mana cost. If that card would be put into a graveyard this turn, exile it instead. So, you know, like I said, just play this at the end of your opponent's turn, Mystic Confluence, bounce 3 of their things, and then you can attack them for 5. Just a really, really solid and versatile card. And finally, for the main deck, we're going to talk about some of our finishers that really didn't fit into some of the other categories. First up is Kefnet the Mindful. He's a 5/5 flying, indestructible, legendary creature god for only 2 of any and a blue, so a 3-drop 5/5 flying indestructible is really, really good. But he says he can't attack or block unless you have 7 or more cards in your hand. Luckily, our signature spell just so happens to let us draw 7 cards. He also has this ability that says, pay 3 of any and a blue, draw a card, then you may return a land you control to its owner's hand. So it kind of lets you get up to that 7 cards in your hand. But, you know, we're running a lot of wheel effects that let us just draw 7 cards, so Kefnet is a no-brainer in this deck. And he's a really, really cheap card, too. He's only like 50 cents right now, so really effective card and a really cost-effective card for your wallet. Next up, we have True Name Nemesis. Not a cost-effective card for your wallet. This guy's kind of expensive. It is a 3/1 for 1 of any and double blue Merfolk Rogue. When it enters the battlefield, choose a player. Then it has protection from that chosen player. So in a 1v1 game, this card is almost unbeatable outside of like board wipe effects. But since Oathbreaker is a multiplayer format, it is not too bad. Other players can still deal with this in a 1v1 situation. It can be pretty oppressive and pretty unfun, but in a multiplayer format, he's actually not too bad at all. Just make sure you choose the player who you think has the most removal, especially like the most spot removal. Next up, we have Frost Titan. I really like this card in Cube, and I don't think it sees enough play in constructed formats because it's a really cool card. And that is no pun intended. He is a 6-drop for 4 of any, double blue creature giant. He's a 6/6. Whenever he becomes the target of a spell or ability an opponent controls, counter that spell or ability unless its controller pays 2. So he's actually pretty hard to deal with. And then he says when he enters the battlefield or attacks, you get to tap a permanent, then it doesn't untap during its controller's next untap step. Just a really solid card. Pretty good finisher for our deck. If we're already wheeling and dealing and our opponents are discarding their hands, they probably don't have a lot to deal with this, and it's going to be really, really just kind of a pain in the butt. And he's Frost Titan, man. And then finally we have Psychosis Crawler. This is an all-star for the deck. It's a 5-drop artifact creature horror. It's a star. Its power and toughness is equal to the number of cards in your hand, which is pretty cool. But it says whenever you draw a card, each opponent loses 1 life. And our signature spell lets us draw 7 cards. So whenever you play that, all your opponents lose 7 life. This card is insanely good for this deck. Really, really good budget option too. Definitely a must include Windmill Slam for Narset Parter of Veils. And finally, let's talk about the lands. Myriad Landscape is a really, really good one for monocolor decks because it lets us sacrifice it and pay some mana to search our library for 2 basics and put them onto the battlefield. So, you know, we get to get some islands, which is pretty good. We have Mirror Pool. Enters the battlefield tapped. You can tap it for 1 colorless mana, and then it has these 2 like copy effects. You can either copy an instant or sorcery spell you control, you know, as you're casting it, or you can create a token copy of a creature that you control. We actually don't have a ton of ways to activate this. We don't have a whole lot of colorless mana producers in the deck because we're running a ton of islands, but I still think it's worth running. If you don't have a copy of this, you definitely don't have to run it. I don't think it's essential. Next up, we have Forge of Heroes. I do think this card is essential. I think it's basically a staple of Oathbreaker. You can tap it at a colorless, or you can tap it and put a loyalty counter on your Oathbreaker if it enters the battlefield this turn. Just being able to get additional loyalty counters on your Oathbreaker, I think is fantastic, even if you only get it when they enter the battlefield. Next up, we have Emergence Zone. This is a new card from War of the Spark. I think it's really, really good in this deck. You can tap it at a colorless, you can pay 1 of any and tap it and sack it, and then you can cast spells this turn as though they had flash. What makes this really good is that Days Undoing ends our turn when we cast it. So we can actually use the 7 cards that we drew from Days Undoing on our opponent's turn and cast them as though they had flash, which is, you know, really, really good. And then finally, for the non-basics, I run Dust Bowl. I think this is a pretty good alternative to Strip Mine or Wasteland. You can tap it and add 1 colorless mana to your mana pool. You can pay 3 and tap it and sack a land to destroy target non-basic land. It's just recurring non-basic land destruction, and I think that is fantastic. And then finally, I run 16 islands with my favorite island art. I really think Noah Bradley absolutely killed it on this one. And there you guys have it. That was my Narset, part of Veil's Oathbreaker deck. Like I said at the beginning, this deck can be pretty unfun to play against. Just talk to your playgroup before dropping something like this because, you know, they might not have a good time. I think some people will actually have a good time with it though. I want to thank you guys very much for watching. Maybe leave a like, a comment, subscribe. I really appreciate it so much. Anyway guys, I hope you have a fantastic day and I will see you next time for some more Magic the Gathering content. I will see you later.